In a sense, I mean, one of the major issue, I think both the countries were trying to position themselves in the kind of post-Ukraine war world.
Gives us a hint that Russia is not going to buckle from its maximalist demands.
We also want the war to end. That is our focus.
That's
because
true.
Once Russia is able to achieve a deal, it would mean that the US pressure on India is released. We need Russia to end this quickly and not drag it on for further.
In 1991, when Soviet Union broke down, Soviet Union was India's number one trading partner, which was built on very special trade and economic, the kind of relationship we had built, reputable agreements. That particular pillar was very badly damaged in the last 25, 30 years.
The war will continue until the point when Russia achieves all the objectives.
I think India would want both Russia and the Europeans and the Americans, plus the Ukrainians, to be able to reach an agreement. That is where we stand right now.
The Putin-Modi summit, the 30-hour speed trip, is a strategic reset in the India-Russia relationship underway. As Modi praises Russia for always standing by India, he also said India was on the side of peace, said they stood together against terror, be it in Pahalgam or the Crocus City Hall, and of course signed a number of critical deals. That we walk together in our fight against terror is what both the leaders said. India and Russia marked 25 years of a strategic partnership that began in Vladimir Putin's first year in office as his country's head of state. This is the first summit to be held in India between the Russian president and the Indian Prime Minister in 5 years, the first in India since the Ukraine war. And just as Cameron foreign policy expert Yuri Ushakov predicted, it was extremely grand and fruitful, the red carpet, the guard of honor, but it's the timing of the visit that couldn't be more crucial. Hello everyone, I'm Nina Gopal. Welcome to Global Express, our weekly deep dive into the news story that's making the headlines. This time, it's the visit to India by Russian President Vladimir Putin for the first India-Russia summit on Indian soil since the nearly 4-year-long Ukraine war began. Here's a Russia that is holding fast to its position during talks with Washington's top envoys in Moscow on ending the war in Ukraine, a war that is changing the power dynamics in Europe and across the world. Does Russia hold the upper hand in this nearly 4-year-long war as it claims? Putin says he will not end the war on Europe or Ukraine's terms. Modi has said that Putin has briefed him on the ongoing talks between Moscow and Washington on Ukraine. He said again that India is on the side of peace. But the Putin-Modi summit has already drawn an unusual comment by 3 serving diplomats, the UK, French and German envoys to Delhi, writing a joint article condemning Russia's war in Ukraine, slamming Moscow for its war in Ukraine with 22 of the largest air attacks in the war since the talks began. It put Delhi in a very awkward position ahead of the Putin visit. How will this incredible bonhomie between Putin and Modi that is there for everyone to see, Prime Minister Modi doing a Tianjin by not only personally greeting Putin on his arrival at Delhi airport, but traveling together in the same car to the Prime Minister's home? How will this impact India's relationship with Trump's Washington, which strangely has suspended sanctions on the Russian oil firm Lukoil, which allows it to continue operating gas stations across and outside Russia? Russia, in fact, has promised uninterrupted oil supplies to India. Will Trump keep up its promise to stop allowing Russia to send oil to India? Talking to us today are 3 Russia experts. Dr. Gulshan Sachdev is professor and Jean Monnet chair at the Center of European Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University. Welcome, Dr. Sachdev.
Thank you.
Dr. Nivedita Kapoor is assistant professor at the Faculty of World Economy and International Affairs, HSC University, Moscow. Welcome, Dr. Kapoor.
Thanks, Nina.
And Dr. Alexey Zakharov is Senior Fellow with the Strategic Studies Program at the Observer Research Foundation. Welcome, Dr. Zakharov.
Thank you, my pleasure.
Let's start with you, Dr. Zakharov, because I know you don't have a lot of time. You're the busiest, must be the busiest man in Delhi at the moment. What do the optics of the 23rd India-Russia summit tell us? The Putin-Modi summit, why is it being watched so closely? And how do the outcomes compare to the optics?
Well, one thing we can say for sure is that India-Russia relationship remains sustainable, that it's keeping afloat. and the meeting between the leaders was rich in optics. We could see different visuals confirming their warm personal relationship, and the whole visit was, I think, aimed to demonstrate that India and Russia can cooperate in many spheres, in different sectors. They are not vulnerable to pressures from outside, and they're trying to deliver a political message that they are keeping up with their strategic autonomies. At the same time, if we look at the outcomes, probably they are more limited as compared to the expectations, because the lists of the documents that we see and actually the text of the joint statement, they indicate that the framing of the outcomes is very vague, and the agreements that are signed are those within the scope of expectations before the summit. And actually, the large part of these agreements have been announced,
Agreed on before.
have been announced by the media before. So there is nothing substantial or nothing new in the list. A question here is that, is it an indication of low substance of the summit? Is it an indication that there are some ongoing talks between the two sides and there have been no agreement on some specific areas of cooperation? Or maybe some of the outcomes, some of the deals are kept under wraps deliberately, just not to attract too much attention from the West, including the sanctions or potential irritations.
If I could come to you, Dr. Sachdeva, there is, if as Alex Zakharov says, there are, pre-agreed outcomes and there are ongoing negotiations on other topics that they don't want to go public. So that obviously means that the Russia-India, reset is actually on. I mean, they are looking at maybe new outcomes, So, I mean, and I've always, we all know that India benefits greatly from the Russian largesse, but how does it really benefit from closer ties to Russia, given the fact that it now faces crippling US sanctions over its, purchase of Russian oil? And I mean, as I said before, US has very strangely lifted sanctions on Russia's oil giant Lukoil. But India depends on Russia, for its oil, even though it's diversifying and talking about going to Iraq and the UAE and even the US. Do you think that's what's actually happening?
Well, I think there are two or three things. One is, I think this was also very clearly designed in this kind of geopolitical environment to demonstrate India's strategic autonomy. When you come under so much pressure from the US and also criticism from the Europeans, that India continue to regard this relationship very special, very close. And the way I think President Putin came, he was very confident. And the way he was given red carpet, Prime Minister went to receive him at the airport and, all other things which happened. That very clear signaling to anybody that this relationship is so important for both the countries that they are not willing to compromise. Now, I think Dr. Zakharov is right that if you look at the documents, there are, of course, after every summit, there have to be certain documents. So there are certain agreements and documents. That has been the case. I have followed each and every summit since 2000 in the last, all the 23 summits which has happened.
Wow, that's
So
something. That's a record.
in fact, I wrote the cover story after the first strategic partnership, which was signed in 2000. And since then, I followed each and every one. So, even if there are declaration or no declarations, these are important events. And as far as this particular meeting was concerned and the kind of geopolitical environment in which we are, I think that many of the things which would have agreed would never come, they will never
Out
go
in the
forward.
open.
In a sense, I mean, one of the major issue, I think both the countries were trying to position themselves in the kind of post-Ukraine war world. Now, how when you are looking actually ahead of a couple of months or maybe that period in which there'll be ease of sanctions, there would be many more opportunities for work together. So the things which they have been able to build now. One of the major point at this point of time, between India and Russia has been, apart from defense deal, they'll continue. I mean, certain whether they were declared in this particular meeting or not, some of the defense negotiations are going on. India will buy some more products, and other things will continue. Now, the one major issue in which they really have to resolve, during the old Soviet period, one of the important pillar of that relationship was very close trade and economic relationship also. When
So it
19
was defense, trade, and economy.
Absolutely. 1991, when Soviet Union broke down, Soviet Union was India's number one trading partner, which was
Oh,
built on very special trade and economic, the kind of relationship we had built, repeatable agreements. And that particular pillar was very badly damaged in the last 25, 30 years because of things, till very recently, it was talked about every time. And you had, our trade stuck about $8 to $10 billion for many years. And all the connectivity projects, which we have been talking again for the last 20 years, International North-South Trade Corridor, and the last few years also, Vladivostok, Chennai corridor, and other corridors. Now, these corridors will not take off unless there are trade volumes. So now
yes.
you have a trade volume of 70 billion, which easily can go up to 100 billion. Now, the question is, in this kind of dynamic situation, how do you really sustain that?
But Dr. Sachdev, haven't you yourself written about the fact that the volume of trade between India and Iran is low, and therefore, while Russia and Iran, the trade volumes are keeping that corridor going, the India-Iran segment is actually very, very slow.
Yes, because where we have very little trade now with Iran and very little trade with Russia, because in fact Russia was supposed to fill that trade volume when we started talking about this, but that trade volume never really picked up in all those years. Now only, so the shipping companies were not able to really move to new directions, even if it was relatively easy. I mean, I would say shorter and maybe perhaps less costly, but they continue to operate through the earlier routes. Now there is a possibility because of this trade wall. If you're talking about 100 billion trade,
Correct.
then there are
By
things where
2030.
their things can become much more attractive. Now, this is also a dynamic situation because you are under, I mean, the companies are under sanction, Russia is under sanction. So, how do you first make the payments? Russia is not much interested in taking Indian rupees because
That's right.
so you have to work out certain mechanism which nobody knows what that mechanism is, but it's working. Obviously, India is paying in different currencies.
It's paying in yuan, is
In
what
paying in
I was
yuan, in
told.
paying in dirham, in paying in other currencies, but the mechanism is working. But obviously, because of obvious reasons, all the details will never be known, outside. But the mechanism is working. But then the pressure continue to be there from the United States. But I think the President Putin himself has mentioned very clearly that they're determined to continue with this trade, and I think India has also shown resilience that it will continue to buy. I mean, even after 25% tariff from the United States, India continue to buy. I mean, but of course, still, how do you really continue to do that? But I think maybe perhaps both of them are looking at this point of time, many of those irritants, perhaps transitional. In a sense,
Okay.
it's a new thing which has opened up. Yes, there may be difficulties in the next couple of months, up to 1 year or so, till the time some settlement has not been made post-Ukraine war. And if that happens, after that, how do you really look into a new emerging situation in which now the Russia is also very clearly looking towards the global south, what they call the global majority. So they feel, in fact, when the question was asked from President Putin by one of Indian journalists whether he would like to join G7, becoming
Yes.
G8, and he said no because then he explained that other countries like India and Global South, they are much more important globally. And of course, they're working very closely with China and India. So they feel that that's the way to go. I mean, because even if the way I think the things are happening at this point of time between Europe and Russia, it will take some time for them to make things normal. It will be quite a long time, even if they are able to work out certain deal with the United.
Let me bring in Dr. Kapoor at this point, to talk about the Russia-Europe dynamic, because Europe's made some very caustic remarks on Putin's India visit. I mean that the three ambassadors writing in an op-ed piece in an Indian newspaper was quite I mean they've I mean, Modi has been and India have been very, very clear that they're not going to take sides on this. I mean, and so why was India made a target? And I mean, Jaishankar also, Dr. Kapoor, he basically clearly said, our foreign minister, that Europe's problems are the world's problems. The world's problems are not Europe's problems. So where does this all lead to? Does it India matter for Europe?
I think, especially, I do see there's a lot of anger and discomfort in New Delhi about this op-ed that the European ambassadors have published, and one can understand that just ahead of President Putin's visit, if such an announcement or such an op-ed appears, it does not reflect very well on the Indians. But here I have a slightly different opinion as compared to what I read from a lot of other Indian analysts, because this is also an issue. Times of India, where this op-ed was published, is not a government newspaper. So if we have an independent press, and if the editor of a newspaper believes that there's a specific opinion that must be brought to before the Indian public, then he or she is within his or her rights to do that. And also because the Russian ambassador the next day got a chance to express his opinions. And that is what an opinion page of a newspaper is supposed to do.
So that's all very well. But the fact is that where does India stand vis-a-vis Europe?
Yeah. But the key issue here is that even though India is saying that we are unhappy with what Europeans are saying, the key issue for India here is that we also want the war to end. That is our focus. Because once Russia is able to achieve a deal, it would mean that the US pressure on India is released. As Professor Sachdeva was just saying, we're looking at the long term. So we need Russia to end this quickly and not drag it on for further. And that will help both in the defense relationship that India-Russia have, and both in the economic ties that India-Russia have. So which is why I think the Prime Minister went on for quite a bit about how India is for the peace. We support peace. We will support all efforts for peace. So even though he's not criticizing Russia, the importance of this war ending for India was very clear. So I think India would want both Russia and the Europeans and the Americans plus the Ukrainians to be able to reach an agreement. That is where we stand right now.
That's very interesting, because the article actually commended India for saying a solution cannot be found on the battlefield. And that I thought was interesting. And it's also good that India is not going to be forced to choose between Europe and Russia, because India needs good ties with Britain and France and Germany, of course, as well as Russia. Now, on the ground, the situation seems to be, I don't know whether this is fact or fiction, but European envoys, Dr. Zakharov, are saying that the war has taken a huge toll on Russia in terms of its people. It says that there are 250,000 fatalities and that Russia has gained only 1% of Ukraine territory. Now, the Russian president has given an interview where he has said that he's not going to give up on Donbass, that whatever happens, he's going to keep Donbass. So what is the real story? Is Ukraine holding its ground? Is Russia, moving forward? What is it?
What we can see in the reality is Vladimir Putin being very confident, coming to New Delhi and giving an interview to the Indian journalists, which was, I think, an important precursor to the summit, as Moscow is trying to explain its narratives and to deliver these narratives to the Indian audience. And I think that in this interview, he's delivering the message that he's quite confident in the current situation, at least for what's happening on the ground. And it gives us a hint that Russia is not going to budge, to buckle from its maximalist demands, and that like the war will continue until the point when Russia achieves all the objectives, and that's period. In terms of the current situation, I think it's important to understand that's the position which we see from Moscow. And the recent meeting between the US delegation, the envoys, President Trump's envoys, which came to Moscow, who came to Moscow to meet with President Putin, it's not clear what were the takeaways from these meetings. We know about new documents that appear within this peace process, a package of documents containing the peace proposals for territories, for the security guarantees, probably some financial conditions. So there are many things to discuss, and there are many things to unravel in this intricate situation.
But Dr. Zakharov, the other point also is during that interview that he gave or he talked about, Vladimir Putin has actually raised questions on who financed and backed Maidan, and the fact that the previous regime in Ukraine was removed in 2014. At the behest of the supposed powers that be. He didn't say who, but could you give us a backstory on how this happened?
Well, I think that President Putin has made a statement before the start of this special military operation that he calls, and I think that this war will be also ended by the statement from Vladimir Putin explaining why it should be ended. That's why I'm not in a position to provide any insights into the situation on the ground.
It's a secure story.
I mean, because there are many different views and perspectives. Some of them are quite right, and from idealistic perspective, it's really unfortunate that the war is still dragging on. But as we see that despite several efforts and even pressure from the President Trump, there is still no end to this story. And it seems that with every passing days, the resolution of the conflict has become a little bit more difficult than it was before. And we can just hope that it will end after this current peace proposal that began a few weeks before.
Dr. Sachdeva, if I can bring you in, do you think India is putting all its eggs in Russia's basket? When the world is, turning very caustic about Russia. I mean, is this a moment that we should actually diversify and, this is a summit which celebrated India-Russia relations, but should India actually look at alternatives too?
Well, I think having good relations with Russia itself is a diversification. Before, India has a good relations with the United States and with Europe. And, the next month, the European Commission President and the European Council President would be visiting India. There would be summit meeting, and there perhaps would be the chief guest of the Republic Day. And, maybe the FTA would be negotiated by then. So the US, of course, they have been working very closely for the last many, many years. And even if you look at the energy diversification, now we used to buy, more than 2/3 energy from Russia. From the Middle East.
That's right.
And all the time we were talking that we should actually diversify from the Middle East because this is an unstable region. Our companies were investing in Russia. They invested about 20 billion starting from Sakhalin-1 by ONGC Videsh. And then, so it means now if actually India start getting more energy, they stabilize somewhere, around 25% or so of our total energy from Russia, because now some kind of new system have been built, that would be diversification of India's energy supply. And if the defense we are diversifying, yes, in percentage terms, we have diversified, we have bought from the United States, from France, from Israel and others. But, our economy is growing. Our threat perceptions are going, and we have next to China. So maybe we will also buying more and more. And when you are buying more and more, you may be buying from Europeans and Americans and others, but you will also continue to buy from Russia as well. So they may come down from 70% to maybe 20, 25%, but still that will be quite significant amount of trade which will happen, even the defense sector with Russia itself. So that's a diversification. I think having a very close, sustained relationship with Russia, I would consider this is part of India's strategic autonomy and diversification rather otherwise.
Dr. Zakharov, could you think that India is doing the right thing in investing in Russia in such a big way under the current circumstances?
I don't think that India has invested too much over the past 3-4 years. I think that India has been quite cautious in investing, whether we invest in politically or economically. We can see one of the announcements concerns the establishment of the pharmaceutical plant in one of the Russian regions. I think that's an important effort which can probably facilitate the shipments of pharmaceutical products, probably their production on Russian soil. So it will definitely facilitate the economic.
But don't you think, Dr. Zakharov, moving ahead on reloss is quite a major thing where they will allow Russian troops and Russian activity on Indian soil and vice versa, Indian activity on Russian soil? That, I think, is quite a huge jump.
Yeah, I mean, if you read the text of the agreement, it seems like as if we're into 1971 again, and India and Russia are ready to call themselves allies. But at the same time, we should take a look at the Indian stance. And I think that this agreement has been promoted by the Russian side, by the Russian government. Russian government adopted the draft of this agreement back in 2024 in June, but it was not followed up by any Indian steps. Then somebody says that probably it was signed sometime in 2025, though I haven't seen any public announcements or any highlights from New Delhi about the agreement, about the commitments, Indian commitments as part of this agreement. And even now, after the ratification by the Russian State Duma, we haven't seen this agreement being a significant part of the summit or being somehow highlighted or presented following the Intergovernmental Commission, which was co-chaired by the two defense ministers. That's why I think that India's position here remains a little bit vague and uncertain, and I would wait until the formal announcement will be made regarding the commitments that India is ready to make as part of this agreement.
That's very interesting. That is very interesting. Dr. Kapoor, if I could come to you about China. India remains very wary about China given its backing of Pakistan during Operation Sindoor and its assertiveness as you have written also on the line of control, on the line of actual control. And, but Putin made a very interesting comment, ahead of this, his arrival in Delhi, where he says Moscow aims to elevate cooperation with India and China to a qualitatively new level. So, you're almost equating his relationship with Moscow's relationship with Beijing and Moscow's relationship with Delhi. Maybe I'm wrong in jumping to that conclusion, but he says this is the objective of numerous joint projects in energy, industry, space, agriculture, and other sectors. India may trust Russia, but can it trust Asia? It's a new power obviously in Asia, and India was having to navigate, the Russia-China dynamic at Tianjin. It was quite clear. And these are the three powers now that India has to contend with: Russia, China, and the US. Where does India fit in?
That is a very interesting question, and especially the Russia-China equation, as you rightly said, that India has been really concerned about just how close Russia and China have gotten. But you're also correct in identifying that equation that President Putin made between China and India, almost as if equating them. This is not the first time, because if you look at the 2021 National Security Strategy of Russia, for the first time, it mentioned China and India both together in achieving its foreign policy objectives. The same pattern was repeated also in 2023 foreign policy concept of the Russian Federation. These are official documents that guide Russian policy. So my interpretation of this would be that by this time, if you actually read Russia's China experts, they have constantly been talking about rising Russian dependence on China. And these official documents, this mentioning of China and India together was kind of a signal, Russia acknowledging that, of course, it has a lot of dependence on China. It deeply values the relationship with China. It does not want any differences with China at this point. But at the same time, it's also Russia that wants to follow balanced policy. It's not just India that wants a multi-aligned policy, because China is a rising power. And it doesn't matter how much Russia presents itself as a great power. Everybody understands that China is today in a different league of power as compared to either Russia or India. So if Russia does want to pursue a balanced foreign policy, then it does need India on its side. So that is the reason why for Russia as well, the relationship with India becomes really important. And this offers an opportunity for India to make sure that Russia remains in its orbit. So because we were also talking about the defense relationship and the energy relationship, it's a means of diversification, and it's also a means of keeping Russia in our circle. Because if you drastically cut down on, let's say, arms imports from Russia, where do those arms imports go?
Yeah.
So you don't want them to go to unfriendly countries. So you build joint relationships and make sure that your partners remain with you, especially in Eurasia, where India is not the strongest player in Eurasia and China is expanding rapidly. So both for India and for Russia, it's important to not go into a war with China, but also make sure that you maintain a balanced foreign policy, which is why both of them, I believe, are continuing to engage with each other.
Dr. Zakharov, do you want to make a concluding remark before you exit the program? Because I know you have somewhere to be in 5 minutes.
Yeah, I have actually 10 minutes more, so I can make 2 remarks if you ask me any question.
No, I basically wanted to look at this defense deal, and I also wanted to say that what Dr. Kapoor said is absolutely right. The fact that Russia needs China more than it needs any other country. So why is Russia, sort of also placating India to a great extent, where the defense deals are concerned and the oil is concerned? Does it need China as much as it needs India, which is something which is curious to me, because China's supply of its defense, of its fighter jets and its missile technology and its radar, etc., to Pakistan was extremely worrying for India during Operation Sindoor.
Yeah, I mean, I think Nivedita made very valid points about the China factor within India-Russia relations, and of course, Russia is logically trying to diversify its connections across Asia. Though I wouldn't exaggerate Russia's reliance on China at this point. In some sectors, of course, the dependence is quite dangerous. I mean, there are not so many alternatives to China in sectors like technologies, or, for instance, in some areas of energy cooperation, like, for instance, China now is the main market for Russian gas, and Russia has lost access to the European market, or European markets, shall we say. In these areas, yeah, I think that the Chinese can now dictate the terms of the agreements to Russia. But at the same time, there are many things that don't meet the eye, like, for instance, that Russia has been hesitant to allow Chinese companies access to strategic sectors of its economy. And the Chinese companies were hesitant to step in and to invest a lot into the Russian economy. Or the Chinese companies have been quite cautious to localize their production when working and operating on Russian soil. So there are many things that show that both sides are quite cautious, even though they are proclaiming their no limits partnership. But China has been rather cautious over these years to proceed with economic cooperation with Russia. And Russia has its own hesitations about deepening strategic partnership with China. In some areas, of course, like if we take the Indo-Pacific, for instance, it's very convenient for both to act in sync and to have a united position vis-a-vis the United States and vis-a-vis other US allies. It's very convenient for both to, to take a common stance and to just criticize everything that is done by the United States. But again, when we look into specifics, if we take into account some regional dynamics, if we look at some issues like South China Sea, or if we look at across the Indo-Pacific, like for instance on India, then Russia will have a more nuanced approach, and I wouldn't say that it's completely on the same page with China. China connection becomes a liability because it starts to prevent Russia from deepening relations with other partners in Southeast Asia or
because Putin has definitely brought up the ASEAN as well. Apart from the global south, he talked about deepening relationship with ASEAN, with BRICS, with SCO.
If we look from an economic perspective, actually Russia's attempt to craft closer ties with ASEAN, they're very similar to India, because Russia is approaching these countries from the very same positions. Like it's offering all the same things that it has in its possession, like nuclear technologies, all the raw materials it has, like LNG, oil, fertilizer, agricultural products. So these are like the Russian strong points that it can offer to the global markets, primarily to the global south. And it comes up to these regions with these proposals. And of course, it's trying to facilitate the existing mechanisms of payments, the supply chains, so that the shipments would be less vulnerable to disruptions and to sanctions.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Zakharov. Appreciate you coming on the show. The defense deals are, of course, a big boost. It's Russian fighter jets, missiles that give India the upper hand during Operation Sindoor, Dr. Sachdev. Now, Russia has war-tested these missiles and drones and so on that could replace possibly French and Israeli and US armory. Is that, something that could happen? Because India has said openly that it wants to acquire the Su-57E fifth generation fighters. It's talked about its the Sukhoi 30, the MiG-20s, Kav helicopters, the Chakra nuclear attack submarine. So, but there is the other question about the S-400, where India was supposed to receive 4 regiments and it only received 3. So, is there the delay? Is it because the Ukraine is sucking up all of Russia's armaments?
Well, I think that was the major worry because many of our platforms are dependent on Russian spares. And many of our programs, they expected that they will continue to buy from Russians. And when the Ukraine war started, there were certain definitely disruptions. And we have seen that thing earlier also in the 90s after the breakup. And in fact, at that point of time, Ukraine was actually providing many of the spare parts to India when we were not able to get from Russia.
Oh, that's very interesting.
But what we have seen now, this is not really my area of research, but I haven't really heard any major concern by our defense forces or the people, those who are specializing this area. There might have been some delays in certain, particular products. But overall, I think the assessment has been, unlike the Western assessment of the Russian weapons, that these weapons for our conditions and the kind of price at which you are getting from Russia, they are quite acceptable. And now, I think why I was saying post-Ukraine war kind of scenario in which they are looking, because what has happened now, one is, once, of course, there is certain stabilization. So the domestic demand, which is there, anyway, it will go down. But in the last 2-3 years, actually, they have ramped up their production extensively in Russia.
I see.
Because the war, which
They've had to.
Yes, because there was no other option. So now, if there is a certain stability in the next year or so, then the production capacity which has been built now, so they would be able to actually provide you much more than actually what they were able to provide you earlier. So I think the Indian Defense Force is maybe looking at that kind of option. And now, of course, many of those things have also been tested. in the war. So,
That's
it would
right.
be perfected, capacities would be bigger, and then India's own program of the whole Make in India program, or the India's, they have ambitions to actually export many of those defense products. And this is what Russia would be quite, I think, keen to work with India as well. Like in BrahMos and others, they can, start doing things in other areas as well. So India's demand, as I said, will continue to grow. And within that, I think they see a very significant role of Russia continue to play, despite having all difficulties what we had. But I think they are seeing these difficulties, transitional difficulties, rather than actually permanent difficulties, and now perhaps maybe more opportunities in the long run working with Russia. So that's why, I mean, many of those big tick things may not be announced because these are continuation. You have so many other mechanisms in which all these things are discussed. Just before that, you had the meeting of the defense ministers, and many, and for obvious reasons, they unnecessarily also do not want to provoke others at this point of time. That
That's
India is buying
interesting.
oil, India is buying weapons, India is doing this something. But I think so. At this point of time, my feeling is, don't look at the documents. Uh, Look at where the future India-Russia defense cooperation and energy cooperation can go, and where Indian more economic interests. They're talking about for many years, of course, they haven't really done anything on that, on India-Eurasian Economic Union trade agreement. Maybe they have to accelerate the negotiation, and then particularly also mobility, because in the last 3 years, thousands of Indians have gone to Russia to work.
Yes, I wanted to bring
And,
up that. I
yes.
wanted to bring
So
up that. I
that's
mean, I
one
believe there
factor.
are
So that
some.
will really bring people to people, because once you have a 50,000 people, 100,000 people living in Russia, that automatically you'll have a different kind of connections now. Many of those connections were there. When thousands of students were working during Soviet period, but now in the last 10, 15 years, most of those linkages were broken. There is a possibility now those links can be, because now those, I mean, they're also looking at India, because there are very little options for them. And the people, those who are coming earlier to work in Russia, particularly from Central Asia, and even in the neighboring areas, even Chinese, etc. Now those are things have changed. So, and particularly last 3, 4 years in the war, most of them have gone back. So they really need badly manpower, not just only skilled, but also semi-skilled kind of people. And I think India can supply many of them.
So there's a very touchy topic that I was talking about to an academic who visited Kiev. He said there are some 30,000 students studying in Russia at the moment, but he met an Indian POW in an Ukrainian jail who said he was framed in a drug deal and forced to join the Russian army to fight the war. Is that something that India should be concerned about, Dr. Kapoor? I mean, you live there. Is this something that is being talked about at all?
I remember this issue being raised very prominently by the Indian Foreign Minister last year with the Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, and also when Prime Minister Modi went to Russia for the bilateral summit. This was one of the key concerns, that some Indians, some of them had been duped into joining the Russian army. They thought they were signing a contract for being a driver or a cook, but instead they were on the front lines. So the Indian government has definitely seized. It was seized of the matter. It discussed this issue with the Russian counterparts, because, of course, in India, this becomes a major issue. You cannot have your citizens be duped and then to be sent to die in a foreign war. So this is, of course, a very important issue, and which is why I think, especially if you see the two agreements that have been signed today, one relates to the curbing of illegal migration, and second relates to the agreement between the two governments on temporary labor activity of citizens. So essentially, the idea seems to be that you involve the governments, make sure that the agencies, because people are mostly duped by agents who promise them something and then deliver something else. So if the governments directly get involved, if the governments make sure that, let's say, a Russian company wants to hire a specific number of workers, then it directly deals with specific agencies on both sides. So that reduces illegal migration. So Russian authorities are less worried, and also Indians are less worried that its people are going to a factory and not to the battlefield. So I think
Yeah.
we have seen movement on that front today.
That's very interesting. Dr. Sachdev, on this Koodankulam nuclear project, taking it to full capacity, I mean, Russia's been a steadfast supporter of backer of India on its nuclear energy needs. It's offering now new technology. Could you explain to our viewers the importance of Russia building India's largest nuclear plant now, the flagship project in Tamil Nadu?
Well, in fact, although we have talked about nuclear thing, 1, 2, 3 agreement with the United States and also discussion with French on Jetapur and others, but the only actually plant which is really operating is Kondakulam and different
Oh,
reactors. Successfully, many of the reactors are operational, others are at different stages of implementation. And now, they are also offering small nuclear reactors, floating nuclear reactors.
that's
Can
right.
really, because the nuclear thing is also a bit difficult because installing a nuclear power plant, there are a lot of local opposition and other things. If you are, you know, having nuclear power is okay, but don't put up the nuclear power plant next to me. I mean, that's the problem always. So if it's just somewhere else, then it's fine. It's in Tamil Nadu, it's okay, but it's somewhere near my house, then I don't want that nuclear power. So there are worries about nuclear power plant. So, but yes, I mean, this is the only, I would say, country with whom we have been actually very successful nuclear, thing we have been working, and they also can supply even the raw material, technology, and everything else. And they want to. So, in the overall, if you look at, I would say, now look at the energy. So you look at not just only the nuclear energy, fossil fuel, but in fact they also talked about even the renewable sector. The prime minister, when he was talking to business leaders, he mentioned that now the China is dominating. I mean, he didn't mention, but China is now dominating this whole the electric vehicle thing. So
That's right.
can India
He said
and
Russia and
Russia?
India
Yeah,
could
and
get together and build electric
most of the
vehicles.
new cars actually electric vehicles in Russia also Chinese ones. We don't have
That's
that many,
true.
but so there are areas in which, and India is the only country which perhaps can really compete with China on the scale. We may be behind China for many years in many areas, but once things take off in India, you have the capacity. Look at the digital public infrastructure. Now today, the numbers of transactions through UPI today is more than the global numbers of transactions of Visa. So maybe
Oh,
the volume in terms of value may be less because there are a lot of small transactions, but you have the capacity to build that huge ecosystem of that kind of any kind of technology. So that's also, in fact, China is also slightly worried about India sometime only because of that, because they feel that India is the only country it can catch up and it can beat the scale what China has. So Russia has clearly identified India to work in some areas, and I think the mobility and other areas, and in certain areas in energy, I think this they'll continue to work in them.
That's very interesting. You should say that because the Chinese taxi drivers in Sydney are all driving Chinese cars. The ones who drive the Indian electric vehicles are not happy with the Indian electric vehicles, and they make that very clear to you. But if I can come back to you, Dr. Kapoor, about the aim of growing Russia-India trade to 100 billion by 2030. There's also a comment that was made that in the final statement saying Russia is looking at increasing its agri-pharma exports to India. Will that go down well with President Trump? I mean, he wants the same, the US to boost his MAGA lobby, right? I mean, if he wants India to open up its agri markets for imports from the US. So if we open it up to Russia and not to the US, how will that go down with Washington?
That is interesting because you're right, because Russia is a major exporter of agricultural products. It is one of its key strengths, and it does want to expand agricultural exports across the world and also to India. I think the devil here will lie in the details because India and Russia operate quite largely on government to government agreements. It is possible that to avoid upsetting the Americans, especially if you are close to a trade deal, it's possible that we will not see a lot of details at this point. And also, what India and Russia could possibly do is that we could open or we could trade in very specific areas. So you're not you don't announce an opening of the entire sector, but you say, so for instance, Prime Minister today was talking about exports of Indian marine products to Russia. So it's a very specific category in which you open. So even in agriculture, you can select a specific category and say India and Russia, we need each other. This is mutually beneficial. So maybe if you do like a step.
What does he mean by marine products?
So this was in reference to, I believe, shrimp exports to Russia.
Okay.
And also,
Because
Prime
our
Minister
shrimp
talked about
exports have come under real
processing.
problem in US because
Sorry, Dr. Sachin?
no, I said we was exporting a lot of shrimps to US. Now they have stopped, so we are looking for new markets.
Ah, I see. Interesting. No, I mean, Delhi is obviously, has several rounds of talks with Russia. I think Moscow before the talks began. And it definitely must have, looked at various ways to increase trade. But isn't it also true that India is trying to substitute its oil imports from Russia, Dr. Sachdev? Hasn't it tried actively to buy oil from Iraq and from other Gulf countries now?
No, in fact, I think the oil coming from Russia is something very different in a sense that, it started with the blessings of the US that India could trade with Russia.
I see.
And then we continue to buy. And a very significant amount of that oil never actually came to India. That was processed here and it was exported to Europe and US and other markets. So now only later some of the Indian public sector companies have started importing, and they might have actually diverted some of them to the Indian markets. That's why the Indian consumer hasn't really benefited greatly in that sense because our prices have not gone down but only thing one can say indirectly because since India was buying this really significant amount of oil, about 180,000 million barrels a day. So that could have stabilized the global energy market because even if it's not coming to India, but it's going somewhere, right, in one form or the another. So the global energy market kind of stabilized because what India was buying from it. This is what the intention, perhaps, of the Americans were also there, and even to some extent the Europeans, because they didn't want to buy. They wanted to send a message to them, but at the same time they also didn't want to, you know, create such a volatility in the global energy market. So this benefited Russians, this benefited Indian company, this also benefited Western company. So even now, I mean the US is trying to look for so many economic opportunities in Russia. They are looking, so many other things, but they want to put pressure on Russia via India, saying that they should not buy India should not buy oil because that will put pressure on Russia. But at the same time, they are looking for many more economic opportunities. In fact, President Putin himself mentioned that Americans themselves they are buying what to say sources which uranium etc. from Russia for their own nuclear power plants. So it's not that they are not doing business; they are also doing the similarly. Even the Europeans are doing it.
Well, now Ursula von der Leyen has actually said
Yeah.
that they're going to stop
Yeah, they are going to stop,
buying.
but even then, I mean, some of the countries within Europe, and the Hungarians will continue to buy. Slovakia is not going to stop that, and some of the other, even the companies which have been under sanctions, they have got special kind of exemptions from the UK. The companies are
That's
still
true.
operating in Germany, and that exemptions have been given. They're looking for those exemptions even from the EU itself. So, it's a much more complicated. So, they're trying to kind of put pressure on Russia at the same time. How do you really keep operating? And that's what I think India has also understood this game, that it's not just only about this, it's something much bigger. So we can also play this game in a sense that, we continue to benefit and then say that, strategically we can do certain things, which in the long run, we build new linkages and which will be beneficial for the Indian companies and overall for the Indian economy. So this is how things are working. And I think those are the issues in which they might have discussed some things in detail. They may not come into any paper here, but that's what I'm saying. To me, this is kind of, giving a new direction to the future relations, which are the new opportunities may come in the years to come.
That's very well said, actually. So that is the biggest outcome from this Modi-Putin summit, really. the fact that it is a strategic reset almost. It's looking at new opportunities to build, new areas of cooperation and commitment to each other. Uh, Dr. Kapoor, would you like to make your concluding remarks?
Yes, just wanted to take up the thread that you were just talking about, how this is a sign of not just a reset, but how they are looking at this world, both India and Russia. I think for both these countries, it is a sign of the fact that the world order that they were used to for so long and in which they were framing their foreign policy, that is changing very rapidly. And nobody is really sure of where these things are going. So we are unsure about the Americans, we are unsure about the Chinese, we are unsure about the international system that will emerge. So in this system, both these sides have seemed to converge on one policy, which is to have a multi-alignment policy, essentially. Make sure that you have balanced ties so that you can maneuver depending on the situation. Don't become over-dependent on one partner, but do not also make enemies of the other. India till now had been doing much better as opposed to Russia, which completely destroyed almost its relations with the West. But if Russia is also able to rebuild its relations with the West and achieve a peace deal, then I think both India and Russia would be on the same page of being these powers that are not great powers, but they're just trying to maintain their position in the international system till they actually know what kind of a world order eventually emerges. So I think in that sense, the summit makes it important for both sides that they can maintain this balanced policy, even if it's not the best. Even if it's not at this point, it might not seem that both are following very balanced policies, but the effort to achieve that remains.
Dr. Sachdev, do you think that Russia is completely isolated from the world economy?
Well, it's not, because if this was the case, then we would be talking something very differently. Now, that was the objective in which I think all the sanctions, there's a huge amount of sanctions which have been put. Now, you can't really put more than that because already everything is under sanctions. Still, we have seen in the last 3-4 years the kind of strategic defeat of Russia, which the Europeans and other Western partners they were looking, that hasn't really happened, neither in the economic front nor even at the battlefront. So that was very clearly seen. As I said, when he came here, he was very confident. And so for just following what Dr. Kapoor mentioned, for India, they obviously look, for them, within our understanding, I think the weak Russia is not in India's interest. Whether you look at, in the context of China, in the context of United States, I think the kind of multipolar world in which we can have much more capability to maneuver, it will be very useful for us to have very strong Russia, because the kind of past linkages we have with Russia and the kind of trust I think still we have. This is in fact very interestingly, because I follow so much closely Europeans, and unlike India, or exactly opposite to India, Europeans simply do not trust Russia because of their own history. And the kind of trust India has with Russia, in fact, even in the recent, I think even yesterday, or day before yesterday, the Prime Minister somewhere mentioned, or very recently, our Sukh Dukh ka Sathi. So the kind of trust. I mean, earlier he said the best friend, and the Russians.
But all that is post Gorbachev, isn't it? I mean, pre Gorbachev and Yeltsin, India wasn't really as comfortable with Russia as it is now.
No, I mean the Soviet period was different one. Again, there was a trust. There was a logic of that. I mean, there was only disruption I could see only during the Yeltsin period in the 90s.
Yes,
Since 2000, when the Putin has come to picture in the last 25 years, all those, I think the trust has been rebuilt again. And
that's
this has
true.
been working. But only thing, in fact, the thing I started, the political, strategic, and military to military, that kind of trust was always there. That pillar was still there. Only thing is that it was not supported by any kind of economic, kind of support. And the kind of role which I think the Russians played, Soviets played during India's modernization process earlier, And we thought that, Russia doesn't have the capacity now to do that. So we started moving more towards the West. Similar thing, I think the Russians in the 90s also were looking more towards, more linkages
So,
with.
in one sentence, if we can sum it up, Dr.
Yes.
Sachdev, and then you, Dr. Kapoor, what is the biggest takeaway from this grand summitry?
It's just continuation of our relationship, which has really shown that despite things the way difficulties, changes, they continue to demonstrate that we are not going to abandon each other. We are very useful for each other, and they are looking for the future possibilities where they can really even strengthen this partnership.
What about you, Dr. Kapoor? What is your big takeaway? Biggest takeaway?
For me, as I said just now, it is
India
the
is
fact that
not, so India is not thumbing its nose at Washington.
no, we are not. For me, this is a continued pursuit of India's multi-alignment policy and making sure that it has a balance, especially when it comes to the Russia-China relationship. I think this is also with an eye on China, making sure that Russia remains our friend, and also to make sure that we are not over-dependent on even Russia.
So it must be said in conclusion that Russia has always been India's all-weather ally, stood by India through its various crises for over 70 years. But New Delhi also has strong ties with NATO partners, particularly the US, which of course has sanctioned Moscow over the war and India over Russian oil. So far, New Delhi has deftly balanced these ties in a diplomatic tightrope walk while refusing to take an anti-Russia line. Will the strategic final document, which is still, being discussed, will it keep India's strategic alignment intact, or is Delhi inching closer to Moscow, to a Russia whose isolation from the world economy is worrying as it tries to strengthen its standing and shore up its ties with ASEAN, with SCO, BRICS, the Global South, against the Europe and against Europe. So where India stands in these forums will also be interesting to watch as China rises, changes the rules of the game, and according to one insider, wants the Ukraine war to continue as Russia's growing dependence on Russia makes Beijing the power to contend with. As the West demonizes Vladimir Putin, we'll have to wait and see whether this Russophobia continues or whether it will be Russophilia as it exists in India. Thank you very much, Dr. Sachdev, for coming on Global Express. Thank you, Dr. Nivedita Kapoor, for your insights. And thank you, Dr. Zakharov, for giving us your perspective. Viewers, please do click on the New Indian Express website and click and share Global Express. Thank you very much.